All right, it's 2 o'clock. I will just welcome everyone here. We've got about 20 people on the call. My name is Devin Dunkel. I'm the membership coordinator here with INN. I'm happy to be here. Today we have our presenter, Scott Lewis. He is with the Center for Collaborative Investigative Journalism. He's going to be presenting on visual journalism for nonprofit news. We're going to give people a couple more minutes to get logged in, and then Scott, I'll ask you to go ahead and get started, okay?
Yep, no problem.
All right, everybody, we're a couple minutes in. I still see people joining, but for the interest of time, I think, Scott, we should just go ahead and get started.
Great. I'm gonna move this, the gallery here to try and, there we go. Okay. Actually, sorry, I can't see my mouse on the shared screen, so I'm trying to find a way to move this gallery. Oh, we're just gonna have to leave it. Okay. Thanks a lot for joining, everyone. Like Devin said, my name's Scott Lewis. I'm the creative director for the Center for Collaborative Investigative Journalism, and I'm going to talk about visual journalism and how to do more. Most nonprofits don't have a ton of resources that they invest in this, and I want to inspire you to think about how to do that effectively. I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about CCIJ, as we call ourselves. We look at ourselves as a capacity building organization that provides support for individuals and organizations focused on investigative journalism of vital issues that impact vulnerable populations. We were created from the beginning to have parity between investigative reporting, visual journalism, and data science. So we really work as a three-legged organization with equal input. Every aspect of this drives all of our reporting. It's a lot of back and forth with leadership and impact on story strategy. Our core team is made up of 8 part-timers, majority female, representing the United States, Europe, Asia, and Africa. We focus most of our work these days on the United States and Western and Southern Africa. We have a network globally of more than 500 members. I think we might be approaching 600, coming from 37 different countries. And you can check our work out at ccij.io, just to give a little context of where we're coming from. So today I'm going to talk about, like I said, visual journalism for non-visual journalists. We work with a lot of organizations and reporters who kind of have to do it all. And we try and help them improve their skill sets to make more impact with the work that they have to do. But we also work to bring on and commission working photojournalists to augment the reporting and deepen the reports that are given. So today, and then also going to talk about working with visual journalists. So what does it mean to hire a photographer or a videographer, and how can that relationship be maximized for greatest impact and make you want to do it again? So today I'm going to talk about why I think visual journalism matters, what we know about how audiences care about visual journalism. Going to do a little bit of a photojournalism 101, kind of a speed dating approach on the essence of visual journalism, what makes it tick, what makes photojournalists tick, and talk a little bit about practical application of some of those ideas, and really want to look at this as an opportunity to seize as nonprofit media is growing and expanding in impact and staffing and depth of reporting. I see this as an opportunity to invest in your organization and your people, which creates more value for the communities that you all serve. So back in 2017, the New York Times, bear with me, did a analysis of where they wanted to be by 2020. And they produced a 37-page report that had 14 key findings in journalism, staffing, and culture. The number one finding that they came up with out of all of their research was just real simple, that it needed to be more visual. And these are their words here, that they needed more proactive inclusion of maps, graphics, images, video data visualization, and to get more comfortable with leadership from the visual side. For me, this has been the essence of the way I've worked for my career when I started out at a 12,000 circulation weekly, and it's continued on through all of my relationships, which I think are still are pretty fruitful. In doing research on this question of the value of visual journalism and what research has been done, there's not a ton, but I found, thanks to some help from a university librarian, this great article from Slate from 2013. And it's a very tongue-in-cheek but substantive piece about how much people actually read when they go to read journalism online. This was their chart. They contracted with organization Chartbeat to measure readership, however they do that. And they found a statistic that I think most business owners wouldn't be thrilled with, which is that most visitors read half of the story. So 1,000-word story, most people are reading 500 words. Most business owners would take that as alarming, I think. Having started a business, I know that it would get my attention. But one thing a statistic that he didn't even mention that frankly I found kind of exciting was this. And this is a meaningful statistic. Most visitors look at all of your video and photo content, which from an editorial and a business point of view, to me, it says this is a place to invest. Not exclusively, but it's a ripe opportunity to capture audience, deepen reporting. It's not just simply looking at pictures. It's about if people are willing to go there, what are we delivering when they arrive? And I think that this is, like I said, a ripe opportunity for investment. I think it's got a business and an editorial strategy foundation. And it's something that I'm excited that I think that there's a lot of desire to do. So I want to get a little existential on this question of what do pictures do for us? What do they do in the newspaper? They don't just decorate pages. They don't just break up text, which is language that I heard when I first started my career. They do really meaningful things. I like to say in my work as a photographer that I strive to connect people through shared humanity, regardless of where they come from, what they think, what they believe, how they feel. I think that photographs operate in a different realm that words do. In our brains and our hearts, emotionally, they connect us with, through common experiences, beliefs, across cultures, why we do things, what they mean to us, in ways that words just don't, which is great because they're companions. This isn't a better or worse. And this was an instance here that really struck me. The picture in question, I don't think is terribly important that we're going to talk about, but this is a story about a man who had seen a photograph of one of the children killed in the Uvalde shooting, and it struck him. And I'm guessing this was a picture of, sort of a school picture or something, a family picture, but it really got to him. And when we think about all of that's been written and antagonized and argued about and pontificated on about, how do we get change to happen when it comes to guns? A simple photograph here. I knew eventually this would get in my way. Oh, there we go. Seeing this picture that connected him to his grandson motivated him to actually turn in his gun. And I found this to be a really powerful endorsement for the impact that pictures have in impacting our communities, whether we're looking for change or we're looking for them to care or pay attention. This to me was a very visceral example of how and why photographs should play an important part of reporting strategies for every news organization. So there's two types of pictures in my assessment. There's the literal, which are simpler photographs. It's here's the thing. These are nouns. It's a person, it's a place, it's a thing. I can see it, I can understand it. They rely on fact and clarity, right? That's their value proposition in the exchange. They're clearly organized with moments, aesthetics. They're simpler. They rely less on a unique point of view and style to drive and tell a story. And their goal is to provide answers and clarity. That's what they do. And the impact tends to be direct and it doesn't linger. These don't tend to be the kinds of pictures that change their value or their meaning for you over time. There's another type of picture that are interpretive. These images are less obvious. They tend to have layers. They're more complex. They may not hit so obviously or clearly upon first read, but over time, they linger. These pictures often are hinged more on a photographer's vision, not something you would necessarily see while walking down the street. This is where you may be standing next to a photographer and they make a picture and you have almost no idea how that happened or what they saw, how they saw it, because you were standing right there, but you didn't see any of that. These are those kinds of pictures that are more magical. These are the kinds of pictures that challenge us and they ask more of the audience for sure. These aren't something you fly by in 6 seconds or 3 seconds. These are things that you're asked to linger on in order to think and absorb the message of the story. These are the unexpected images, the surprises, and these are the kinds of pictures that evoke feelings, thoughts, ideas. So I'm going to explore some examples of these. So these two pictures are from a project that we did in the Gambia with a British photographer and a Gambian reporter on water contamination, which we've been focused on at CCIJ for the better part of the last 2 years. Picture on the left falls into more of the literal category for me. It's pretty straightforward. It's beautifully executed, right? It's not lacking in impact. And this is a picture that really brings the story together about the overlapping issues of water sources here on the right, in the bottom corner, the loose animals that roam the streets that contaminate the water through waste, and then it cycles back to consumption. The picture on the right, same story, but it takes us a little bit deeper into the lives of the people who are impacted by this. There's a subtle message here of, the role of water with laundry hanging, and it's a picture that I think that anyone anywhere in the world who has children can relate to. To me, it speaks to the vulnerability of people in this circumstance. You couldn't plan for this image on the right. You could kind of plan for the image on the left because this is all about facts that we already knew going in. Image on the right has to be responded to, has to be seen and felt by the photographer in the field. Here's another example from the same project. Image on the left, it's a scientist showing the dirty, nasty water, right? That's filled with excessive amounts of iron. Really straightforward, again, very well executed. Picture on the right is a man washing his face after prayers. Again, you could kind of predict this image in that if you know something about Muslim culture, you know that there's a lot of washing involved around prayers and rituals, but the way this photograph's composed, the composition, the isolation, the time of day, all those things contribute to a more visceral feel, which, is a more emotional, evocative image. And this last set, picture on the left was taken by a writer. And I'm going to both of these pictures actually were taken by writers. Picture on the left was a picture in Lesotho about a story about a community that lived around massive reservoirs of fresh water, but because of a lack of infrastructure, they had no access to it. So they had to lug buckets down to open wells, fill them up and carry them back to their home. This is a beautiful, impactful picture that tells a great story, but it's one and done. You kind of get it, you understand it, and you sort of move on. Picture on the right, also taken by a writer, Kunle Adebayo, who's a Nigerian reporter with an organization called Hum Angle, which is a new media outlet based in Lagos. This is a picture about the encroachment of the desert in the northeastern part of the country. Where this man standing is where a village once stood, where the desert had encroached, taken over where people's homes once were. This picture is a little more abstract. It asks a little bit more of you to think a little bit more, understand the context a little bit more. It's a little more symbolic because literally the thing that we're talking about doesn't exist anymore, the village. And so you have to kind of, there's a little bit of a leap of faith, but it challenges you more to think about the loss of something, which can be a very hard thing to photograph sometimes because it is no longer there. And I asked a couple of people we've worked with to talk about their relationship with the work that we've done to try and inspire thinking about visual journalism in different ways. And Ryan Christopher Jones here is a photographer that we've worked with on a couple of projects in California. I'm going to share some of his work in a little bit. His words here, Ryan is also off to become a PhD at Harvard in visual anthropology, and he's a very thoughtful, smart photographer who's written for the New York Times a bit as well. But the word here that he uses that it really resonates with me when we talk about interpretive images is meditate. It's different than what we ask of sort of the more high impact, straightforward pictures. And that we accept that there are going to be pictures that visually challenge us, that we're going to challenge the audiences with pictures that aren't so straightforward or familiar to us in the language of the visual language, what we've been taught to expect about what a quote good picture is or is not, and start opening up room for those kinds of things. It's a high bar. You know, this is not something that's easy to photograph, nor is it easy to see as an editor. But when you open up to that possibility, you start to open up to a new language with your audience. And this is something that, and I'll provide the PDF of this, again, this little gallery thing that I can't find at the bottom. I've just sort of diagrammed out what I think photojournalism really comes down to. I think there's 4 basic categories, and this is a very crude analysis of what photojournalism I think is. Action, not action, places and things, and ideas. And then within each of these are a breakdown of what composes the elements of this category of photojournalism. You're talking about newsworthiness, interactions of significance on action. I like to talk about thinking of things as verbs, you know, people doing. What is when we talk about when do we photograph people, what are they doing? It's, well, why are they newsworthy? And what are they doing and when are they doing it for the thing that makes them newsworthy? And this is where you get that immediacy, the impact, the intimacy that comes from what things are doing. And these can be quiet photographs. These can be dramatic photographs. Not action tends to be portraits, which is done a lot for various reasons. But there's ways to bring different elements to the table to make those portraits engaging and hold their own to more documentary images that are capturing meaningful actions, newsworthy actions. And this is where rapport becomes a huge element between photographer and subject. You've got, you know, your setting, the pose, the environment, props. Even though we're in photojournalism, we still do have to think about these things. And once we're doing portraits and we're controlling the situation, we do still have to factor in those kinds of things and control the image and what's being shown. Places and things are things like details, landscapes, again, how an image is organized visually, depth of field, composition, lens choice, all those things play in even more significantly here. I cannot emphasize more time of day as it plays into landscapes. That will transform your work, and I'm going to show some work later about that, from unengaging to potentially emotional. And that is all about time of day. Other things that affect landscapes are scale, you know, like, can we put a person in this, a dog, a car, a tree, something that gives us a sense of how big this place is. Juxtaposition also plays a large role. And then ideas, and this is where the interpretive image discussion plays in. These are less literal stories, where you're trying to capture something that's a little harder to see and identify. Style, point of view really drives the success or failure of the narrative and the content. This is a more complicated approach to thinking and editing. And this is a much higher bar where a story might be developmental, where it's A plus B plus C equals D. This is a story where each image stands on its own as an idea, an issue that when interlaced with other images creates a much greater whole. So here's some straightforward pictures, just some simple examples. This is a picture of people gathering water. For me, the fact that they're not actually, no one's actually literally getting water allows me to focus on something a little more human, a little more relatable, which is sort of the physicality. You know, that I realize these are mostly young people. Makes it easier to relate to as a parent. You notice the body language of the boy on the left, where you can feel the weight of that bucket. It just creates a little bit different way of processing this scene than if they were literally focused on the action itself, which would almost distract me from the more human aspect of this. This is from a project that we did with Ryan in California on water, battles for water between agribusiness and small farmers. And this is a really simple picture, but there's something really intimate about it too, that to me, it speaks a little bit to the vulnerability of small farmers and what they're growing. But, you know, it's a simple picture, but it's, you know, literally somebody doing something. Again, another picture of Ryan's from another story we did with, actually, I should give credit for SJV Water, the one-person nonprofit newsroom member of INN, of Lois Henry. This is a story about the town of Corcoran that was sinking. And this was a really hard story to photograph, because even though you would think that a sinking town would be the kind of place that you would be able to identify, there really wasn't identifiable sinking that we could see. So we had to get at the feeling of living in a place that was sinking, with this looming dread. And so we talked a lot, very abstract terms. And what I love about this portrait is, even though there's nothing happening here, and he talked about the flooding that happens on his aunt's street, that sense of suspicion, and this is about that's there in his face. And this is where it comes down to rapport between the photographer and subject, that really conveys emotion, where he went beyond just simply a photograph of a person. The light is beautiful. It's a riskier composition, shooting on the backside of the light, but it really works. This is a more straightforward portrait, again, from the same project that Ryan shot in California on family farming. And again, this is where you're controlling all the elements, right? Where are we going to take this picture? You know, the way the light is hitting this boy in the center, standing on this old broken chair, questions about whether they'll be able to continue the farming tradition of the generations of family. There's a little bit of a symbolic nod to tradition with that old time chair that's barely standing up. You know, the family gathered around. Not everybody's looking at the camera smiling. All these things add into the message and the feeling of the story, that where it becomes a little more layered. This, again, like I was saying about time of day, you know, this picture is beautiful. I mean, it's obviously not a beautiful situation, but it's a beautiful photograph that becomes, to me, deeply important from a content perspective about not enough water, right? You've got this, you know, little bit of water backlit by the setting sun, you know, and this is a photographer that is out there working really, really hard, looking for how to photograph something that doesn't exist, that you can't literally see. And in this moment, by choosing this time of day and working till dark, it transforms this place that otherwise would be kind of an ugly scene. And sometimes that's fine to see something that in its ugliness, but this really transformed it, and it becomes, to me, a more evocative, emotional image. And the same thing here, where the setting sun ticks off all these little yellow tree supports. This is a farm where they're planting, I believe, pistachio trees. And the time of day is essential here to understanding the image, the messaging of this is a water pump that's pumping water from underground to be used on crops. And lastly, this is another picture from the Lesotho team, time of day. I mean, I jump up and down. If you're going to be doing landscapes, time of day is everything. And sure enough, they were out there 5 o'clock in the morning, waiting for the sun to rise. And that makes this picture really evocative, and it can hold its own as a lead image on a page and really engage you with the story. In this case, it was a story about huge reservoirs of fresh water that the people who live nearby can't access. And this gets into the ideas category of pictures. This picture was, again, Ryan on the battle for water. And this gets at the infrastructure, the way that we as people are impacting the landscape. There's the eeriness of this image is driven by smoke from fires, driven by drought. So every element of this picture, the literal elements of this drain pipe, as well as the mood, are all deeply within the reporting of the story. So there's editorial content in the aesthetics as well as the facts of the matter. And this is a picture from a project we did in Zimbabwe, photographers in Yenge, Autonomy, of getting water. This is how they get their daily water, with this little bowls out of a borehole. And I like this image, again, like the first one on Action, where it's not literally them scooping the water out, but seeing the toes of the person there and their reflection in the water just makes it more human for me. The aesthetics are strong, and it's curious. Composition is compelling. These are all things that engage me beyond just simply, oh, look, they're scooping water. This makes me think about other things besides scooping water, which when you do, like we have a lot of stories on water, I work really hard to try and get away from tropes, like people carrying water in buckets. And I think that's an important thing to think about when you are doing visual journalism, is to think about the ways that these stories are typically told and find ways around that, because that brings something unexpected to the table for readers. So how do you do this? There's a way to break down some of the mechanics of making images that are impactful. Things you want to think about, and this is going to sound familiar, and I don't know how many writers we have here today, but I'm thinking a good number of people, very similar sort of structure, but you look at it through a visual lens. Your depth of reporting, and this comes down to, as a photographer, you have to be there when things are happening. So it's, when are you doing the thing that makes you newsworthy, and I will be there at that time. And then understanding the larger context of that newsworthiness in order to understand in that moment, how does this thing that's happening in front of me relate directly back to the story that you're telling? So these are these conversations that need to happen between the reporting team to understand the story that's being told. And then how are you telling the story? This gets into style and lens choices and lighting and composition choices. Lenses are tools to use to tell stories. So you want to think about all those elements as to what role they play. The photographer-subject dynamic, even as a documentary photographer, this matters. You want people to be comfortable enough with you to do the thing that, again, makes them newsworthy, so that you can capture the story without impacting it. This is where you talk about going early and staying late. Most good photojournalists know that you always arrive early and you always stay late, because you will often get the unexpected image around the scenes. It's not always the center stage moment that is the most compelling image. A lot of times it's the more unexpected places, the unexpected people that capture something that's harder to identify until you're there. And this is where your sense of the story is important, to understand how a small moment off stage, and I mean that metaphorically, can be really compelling. Technical concerns are innumerable, and I'm not going to go too deep at all into this, but photography is a highly technical endeavor when you're doing it, with SLR cameras and lights and all that stuff. But all those things actually play into the storytelling aspects as well. And ultimately, camera placement, where you put that camera. So physically, where are you in the room? and this requires sort of a 360-degree sense of awareness about the situation, where moments are happening, where moments could happen. A lot of being a good photographer is anticipation and being ready in a place where a moment's going to happen. And there's no one rule for this. Every situation has different dynamics and demands on it that push a photographer to decide where they're going to put themselves and their camera. So your goals in this are to make people feel something, which motivates caring, which motivates doing. It gets beyond the rational part of the brain and into the, I don't want to say irrational, but a more emotional place, a more visceral place. You want to get people to think, what do I care about? Why do I care about it? How does this make me feel about a story? And photographs can do that in ways that are unique to visual storytelling. Getting beyond all the cliches about the universal language of it, it's still real. You want people to understand, can we bring clarity to a situation? Can we bring a deeper appreciation for nuance and for how a story that may seem abstract and technical on one hand can be very real for people. And then ultimately, and this is a big thing for me, is don't repeat what words are doing. Photographs aren't a success if they just repeat the words in a story. They are a success if they take the reader someplace new, and if they connect them to those words in a different way. This is where photographers and writers and words and pictures can live side by side, and they can tell different narratives, but they're complementary. It's kind of like a Venn diagram. They can actually operate independently. So the way that when you approach a story photographically, and these are the kinds of things that I go through with writers that we work with when they're going out on their own without a photographer with them. Like I said, go early and stay late, build rapport, 360-degree awareness, watch and learn. Sometimes the best photographs come because you weren't photographing, because you were watching and engaging and observing. Camera placement, anticipation, staying with moments. When something happens, you don't just take a picture and be done. The analogy that I would like to use is you sort of wring it like a towel until there's no water left. So if there's something happening, you start photographing and you do not stop until after the moment has ended and it is clearly over with. And so you may see, if you work with photographers, you may see them behind the camera and not stepping away from it, not stopping. It's because they're watching that moment unfold and staying with it and getting closer than you think you can or should be, a lot closer. You want to fill the frame with meaningful things. Same way when you write a story, you don't want superfluous words or quotes that repeat. You want variety, you want tight, you want wide, you want some with some distance, you want some close up. And then you're always looking for a surprise. So I'm going to put some of this into action. So for those of you with kids for summer camp, the camp that my kids go to have a countdown. And each kid can choose, or if they want to do it, they get a day. And so my kid's day was day 47 days until summer camp starts. And my wife, and in her defense, was antsy about getting the picture done. And she just did it. And I love my wife dearly, but this is not a great picture. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why. So 75% of this picture is the floor or the top of the table. You've got a napkin holder growing out of my daughter's head. You've got a balled up piece of paper. You've got a single placemat. You've got a half full glass of water. You've got a cabinet in the background, awkward expressions, cut off feet, awkward positioning. And, so she knows that I'm doing this. So I'm not throwing her under the bus without due warning. So I came home and I was like, okay, let's start over. And with literally nothing more, I have no other tools. This is on her phone. I used my phone, that I took a different approach. And I brought together just the core elements. I stood above them, had them lay on the floor. I simplified things to the core essence of what this image should be. So in a simple way, like, this is not about tools. This is about how you can conceive of the way of telling an image with impact, and working a situation to think through what's important, how do I fill that frame? And I wanted to show another take on this about staying with a moment and being thoughtful and intentional about your images. So this is from the story on the Gambia, where the photographer saw this situation and he worked it and he drilled in, he saw the moment, he didn't stop. And this is a veteran photographer who has been to war and is very accomplished. And when I wrote him and said, can you send me this group? And he sent me like 2 frames. And I was like, you really got that in 2 frames? And he was like, no, I'm not that good. And, you know, so I wanted him to share sort of this process of, you know, how he gets there, how you really work a situation where, yeah, okay, each moment's good. It's good. It's not bad. We're getting there. There's stuff happening, but you don't have time in the moment while this is happening, the 40 seconds that it takes for this scene to unfold, to figure out which moment of the splashing water is the best. So you work it until it's over, whenever that is. And then ultimately you land on the image that he sent me this one frame. This is the only frame he sent me, and I didn't ask for any others because it just simply worked. It was a raging success. It hit me. It was impactful. It did everything it needed to do, and he knew it. And in seeing the take afterwards, he was right. This was the one frame, but it's a way that like a working photographer will work a situation, never letting go until they get to that moment where it's over. I want to take this one step further and talk about the writers that we've worked with. So these are 2 writers that work for an outlet in Lagos, and I did a session kind of like this with them before they left. They were out in the field in the desert for 2 weeks, and they had never done extensive photography before, but I walked them through something kind of like this about the role of photography. And this is the report as we published it on the encroaching desert, where they were telling a complicated story about the way that the desert's encroaching, which is minimizing access to water and resources for herders who are then pushing their cattle to farms. And then there's battles ensuing between the herders and the farmers. And this is a case here where a man had been shot with an arrow by a group of herders who had come through the farm he was the foreman for. So these guys, these 2 writers, Kunle and Murtala, were just fantastic and really taking it to the story. They worked really hard at telling the story visually. And then I went through in the edit and they literally sent me every single frame they shot. And they had hundreds of pictures of sand. But they really came in, they got some images that were storytelling that allowed me to put together an edit that was able to convey the circumstance. It's not like the deepest photojournalistic reporting in the world, but I think for them, and from a writer's perspective, they really brought back an impactful report of the encroaching desert, photographed some stuff that's hard to see. Again, you know, things that are disappearing, but they really took us there and helped us understand the circumstances, the dynamics, what's going on. And as much as we cover, and I think a lot of us think about this, these vital issues, then we want to also think about, you know, what's being done to fix this, you know, and they didn't stop with their efforts to convey that visually as well. So here's, like, we've heard about the Great Green Wall that's growing across Africa. Well, this is a part of that Great Green Wall. And this is what it takes to build that. And it really does things that words, I think, couldn't necessarily do quite as well, which is to really show what that looks like and feels like out there in the middle of Africa, in the middle of this battle. And these are some words that Kunle shared about this experience and the impact that it had on them as reporters. And I think in their appreciation for visual journalism and what it took to do it and how it enhanced their own reporting, and how they saw the role that photographs can play in standing on their own and speaking for themselves. And we're not the only ones who do this at CCIJ. I wanted to show some work that other nonprofit news outlets do great visual journalism, and got a couple of stories from Luna from High Country News. And this was a case where they actually, this was led by a photographer, and they wrote to the photographs, which I think is a great way to celebrate the role that photographs can play, going back to the New York Times. And, I think the New York Times, because of who they are, we can all steal from them and we can learn from what they're investing in and just take the lessons, and we don't have to go through the trial and error. But let visuals lead and let visuals take readers to a different kind of engagement with the story. And so this was a project where it was a writer doing the photographs, and they did something interesting visually. This is their print publication, which is very special to have these days. But I think that the attention to detail in the design is really impactful here. They took pictures that I think were pretty standard and really made an impactful presentation by cropping them all into panoramics. Regardless of whether you would have cropped one of them that way, they decided to really take that forward, and it emphasizes the idea that you want corner to corner, edge to edge, meaningful content. Something meaningful in there that really drives home the impact of a story in a dramatic way. And so I want to talk a little bit about working with photographers. We have a reputation of being difficult, and it's not necessarily unearned. However, for me, this graphic really kind of gets at the heart of it, I think, which is, if we judge an elephant by its ability to climb a tree, we're going to deem it a failure. And I think that understanding photographers and writers understanding each other has to do with understanding what they're good at, the way they view the world, what their skills are, and then hold them to those expectations in a different way. So writers are different than photographers, right? They think differently, they work differently. They tend to be a little more analytical. They think more in words, more linearly, in sort of a sequential logic. In journalism, right, you think around facts. And this all makes sense, necessary, it's the right way to do things. Photographers are not necessarily like that, and nor should they be. And this is where the combination of words and pictures become more impactful. So photographers are more expressive. They think in visuals, obviously. They're intuitive, right? Choosing moments, all of the things I've talked about are an intuition that's developed through skills, experience, gut instinct. They look for a rhythm. We look for a feel of something. Photography at its best, I think, is more like jazz. It's not necessarily programmatic. It's a lot more improvisational, and you're looking for those rhythms in order to produce work that ultimately comes together holistically. You think in these broader ways, and it allows the audiences to have different kinds of experiences with the journalism. Ultimately, this is a partnership. And I just want to emphasize some things to embrace and avoid from writers and photographers. So let photographers lead in their visual reporting. They know the language, they speak the language, and let them lead that. Collaborate, listen, trust each other. These are ways that we can bring these relationships forward to greater impact and value for audiences. As a writer, ask the photographer what they think about the story, not necessarily about the visuals, but the story itself. That's what you guys are partnered on. And listen and be open. They may change your direction of your story. And that's usually a good thing, that if you've changed the direction of a story, that means you've discovered something out there that, takes you in a new place. You've learned something, and that means you have something new to bring back to your audience. Things to avoid. Telling photographers what to take a picture of. If you have trust, and if you guys are on the same page, this is the photographer being a professional. The photographer knowing what's important to the story and how to tell it. When a photographer's in a moment, photographing something that's happening, start trying to have an interview with a subject or asking a subject questions while a photographer's trying to capture moments, is undermining their ability to do their job in exactly the same way that if you as a writer have a series of questions and you want to build to a certain apex, you don't want a photographer interrupting those questions because you've got a structure you're trying to hold on to. And this, again, deciding what, when, and how for a photographer. So if something's happening at 4 o'clock in the morning, that's when the photographer will be there and should be there. Deciding for a photographer, oh, well, they're not going to want to get up early, so I'll just schedule something else, or I'll just have them do that thing at another time. This is sort of an ethical quandary for photographers that writers sometimes appreciate, sometimes not. But for photographers, it's, in my view, and in most sort of on the NPPA ethics, it's never okay to have a subject change what they're doing or when they're doing it for our convenience. It's our job to be there. And the last thing is to let the story structure dictate the photo edit. You want there to be, again, the Venn diagram. Overlap, there's no right or wrong here in terms of hard and fast rules, but you want there to be some overlap where photographs have their ability to be laid out and structured in a way that's natural for them, that creates the most impact for them. And sometimes that does align with the structure of a story and sometimes not. And I think that it's a judgment call on an individual story. So how do you inspire a photographer to get on board with this stuff? So when assigning a photographer to something, I like to, this is a summation of everything I've been talking about. Talk about what the story is about, not what you think the picture should be. Talk about why you're doing the story. Who or what is important, what details, locations are important, what events are happening that are relevant and important. This, with engaged visual journalists, this will get you there. When you empower visual journalists to have a say in the destiny of the work, in my experience, they will work much harder. They will make a much deeper investment in understanding and in bringing forth a powerful story than if they're just told, show up here and take a picture of this. That's a surefire way to shut people down to not want to be pushing further and doing more. But this is a framework that I've used my entire career and that I've learned from that really asks more of the visual journalist to show up for the story and to show up for the work they're doing, while at the same time advancing the possibilities of the work that you do. And that is
that's the presentation.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Scott. We do have a couple questions if you're ready for questions.
Sure. Here, I'll stop sharing so I can put the mouse.
All right. So our first question we got in the Q&A was, in a newsroom where you have mostly willing reporters who want to start dipping their toes in photojournalism, what kind of cameras and lenses would you recommend starting with? And do you have any technical training you'd recommend?
Oh, I mean, honestly, I think that if you want to go beyond like using a phone, there's almost too many options to consider, honestly. If you're at a basic level, cameras that have interchangeable lenses, and you want to be able to have anything from a wide angle all the way up through a moderate zoom. So anything from about a 28mm lens on the wide end, upwards of 200 on the long end. I'm a fan of higher quality as opposed to lower quality, lenses and glass. So, but it's almost an endless sea of options. But Fuji, Nikon, Sony, Canon, the top tier brands that we all know are great places to start. And technical training, I mean, community colleges are a great resource for this kind of basic, hands-on learning of how a camera works, how to use it, understanding depth of field, shutter speed, all that kind of stuff. Local art centers are great places to get this kind of basic training off the ground. You don't have to think about National Press Photographer Association level trainings, which they don't even do that kind of stuff. But those kinds of places are great resources to start with.
Thank you. That's really helpful. If anybody has any other questions, we have one more, but I just want to send a reminder. Oh, here they come. A technical question from Andrew Phillips. What sorts of media releases, if any, should we make sure to get when making portraits, as well as making photographs in businesses, e.g. photos of workers in a restaurant kitchen?
For editorial purposes in the United States, you don't need a release at all if you're using it for editorial reasons. You only need a model release in the United States for commercial use. So if you're going to take that photograph and use it to advertise a business, which most news outlets aren't doing. If you're advertising your own organization, if you use it in context of the reporting, so if you take, for example, like your homepage with the photograph on it to advertise or to market in the newspaper, you don't need permission because that falls under a fair use kind of arrangement because it's being shown as part of the product of journalism. So just, basic okays from people is enough.
Great. Wow, we're getting a lot of
cool.
a lot of questions. All right.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
This one's good. Jeffrey Ruiz asks, how should I manage my time when I go out alone to report and photograph?
That's complicated. Every story is different, and you have to make choices because it's hard to do both. And I think when it comes to this, it's what can you do on the phone? What can you do in a sit down discussion with somebody versus what do you need to do photographically to tell the story? So I think it requires a little more time management, but I think it comes down to that particular story and when and how different kinds of work can and should be done. So if you have a farmer, and he's getting out to go get his cows to bring them in for milking, that's not a time to have an interview, right? That's a great time to photograph. And maybe the time to interview is at lunch. She's that an example. So I think it's hard to give like a hard and fast rule, but I think each situation needs to be evaluated. It really comes down to how and when are you going to be able to make the most impact with words and interviews and then with photographs as well.
I think your answer gets to our next question/comment here from Bart Fankich. Like you noted, most nonprofit newsrooms are operating with journalists who serve as reporters and photographers. 30 years in, and I still struggle at times to get great art while I'm so deeply focused on reporting, asking and listening, taking notes, getting detailed info while in the field. There wasn't much of a question there, but it was a relevant comment for sure.
I would have something to say to that. And that is believe in the value of investing in visual journalists. I think that when news organizations have an opportunity to make a hire, think about making a hire in the visual journalism space. Believe in the value of investing in those people who bring those specific skills. And that doesn't necessarily mean a full-time staff job. It could be a contract role. It could be for a particular story. And that also applies to editors. There are tons of people who do freelance editing who could come in. If you've got a big project and you believe you want to make an impact with it visually, you could hire a visual editor just for a project. So I think that if we believe in, from a business strategy and an editorial strategy, that this is worthwhile, then we should think about how we use the resources we have, whether that's asking reporters to double up, or if it's saying like, we're going to take some money and allocate it to this because we truly believe it will bring returns.
Thank you. That's very good. Katie St. Clair says, I could use composition help, balance in a photo. Some pictures you showed say the desert with the man on the tree. There's empty space to the left, at least to my untrained eye. Can you explain a bit about this?
Yeah, breathing at a cursory level is breathing. There's breathing room. If you crop a picture within an inch of its life, you lose some context. But also I would say that empty space is quite meaningful in this story because it reemphasizes the point that A, the desert's encroaching, and B, there used to be a community here. So that emptiness becomes part of the message of the story. But every photograph is different. In some cases it works, in other cases it may not. So I think that the photograph itself, it's composition is very individual in the moment and the style of the image. In some cases, you want a tight composition for intensity, for impact. You don't want a distraction. And then in other cases where you're trying to tell a looser narrative or a more complex narrative, you want a little room for moments to have a space to be in.
Thank you. Camilla Forte asks, how do you bridge the disconnect some writers feel when mid-reporting? In my experience, reporters sometimes feel like they do not know enough to tell the photographer and may hesitate to get them involved early on, especially for more long-form narrative pieces.
Well, at CCIJ, we start day one together. And I believe it's always the right decision to start day one together. It's okay if you don't know the answers because you'll figure them out and so will they. And you might be surprised at what they bring to the table at that early stage because they're going to think about this story in a very different way. And they may bring some abilities to start thinking about how you're going to tell that story visually early And that's always a good thing to bring them on day one, start together, start fresh, and they may not start shooting for a while, but at least they're engaged in the process. And I'd say the same on design for the organizations that have designers, because you can start conceiving of how you might tell that story over time.
That makes sense. Linda Ju says, excellent presentation, thank you. And she says, how does one manage doing the reporting of photography at the same time? Okay, I think we kind of touched on that.
It's hard. There's no bones about it. It's hard. Yeah.
Bart again asks, any thoughts on use of submitted art and or how to get better submitted art?
How to get better submitted art. I don't know that there's really a great way to do that. On the use of it, I think it depends. I think there's time where it's okay. I think there's times where it can get a little sketchy ethically because you don't know the provenance of the image or what you're presenting and how you're presenting it. I'm not saying it's impossible to do. It just becomes something to be thoughtful about, as well as what's the story, you know, and what's the importance of having those images. Again, there's no hard and fast rule for it, but I think it's something that should be taken with a lot of thoughtfulness and consideration.
Andrew Phillips asks, are there other basic ethical rules of photojournalism that we should be aware of? I'm familiar with some basics, e.g. not editing a photo in a way that changes the meaning, but wondering if there are others around editing, when to make posed versus candid photos, etc.
I'd say the National Press Photographers Association has on their website some basic ethical guidelines for photojournalism. And I can get that link and share it, and it can be shared. Like, I'll send a PDF if you guys want to have the presentation as a PDF, and I can share that. What I'd say is, if it's a candid image, leave it alone. Don't influence the scene. Don't set it up. Don't ask people to do things. Make it genuinely candid. If you're going to pose something, make it obvious that this is a portrait, that this is a posed image. Usually that comes from the posing or directly looking into the camera. I mean, sometimes people can be looking off camera, but it's, you know, not trying to fool people that you're posing something that is actually, or you're posing a situation that you're conveying is a real moment happening. That's where you get into the ethical questions, that you're tricking the audience. And then what you've done is, the audience who are reading that may not know, but the person who you took those pictures of, they know. And they're going to tell their friends, like, yeah, no, he had me do those things. Well, you've immediately undermined your credibility as an news organization when you have people in your community saying what you're seeing was faked.
Yeah.
Sorry if I got a little soapboxy there, but.
No, that's good. It answers the question. We have about 1 more minute left. Michelle Canar asks, do you have any recommendations for stock photography resources or straightforward visualization platforms?
Visualization platforms, I'm not sure what they mean by that. Stock, I mean, I guess that depends on your budget and what you're looking for. There's, you know, Getty is obviously the big 800-pound gorilla, the Associated Press as well. But, you know, if you're looking for things that are more illustrative, I mean, it's kind of endless in terms of the options out there. I'll be very careful about some new organizations. Unsplash is one that where there's no, again, provenance matters. So you have to know if the copyright and releases have been vetted properly for sale for stock. That's a different question. There was a release question earlier. This is where you get into questions on releases. Editorial images can be licensed without a release, but if the image isn't released properly from the creator, that could be an issue. So there's been a lot of theft going on where people will download images, create a stock agency of images they've stolen, and then start licensing them. So you have to be really careful about vetting the organization you work with. Alamy is another one, ALAMY. But there's a lot out there, so hard to say exactly what topic also you're looking for, whether it's news or illustrative images.
Okay, well, we are right at 3 o'clock, so I will put a stop. We have a few more questions here in the chat.
Happy to answer. Yeah.
we could keep going, and this part, if anyone has to drop off, this will be included in the recording. We just answered that one. Shireen says, can you point people in a direction to find good freelancers? We started to make a spreadsheet at INN, and she shared the link. I can share it in the follow-up email, but we could do more perhaps.
Local markets are going to be your best resource. And I mean, I would start with, there's no single catch-all. I mean, I think the National Press Photographers Association does have a database, but Google really, it does work, and starting with the closest mainstream daily newspaper to your community would probably also be a place to go, because the US, at least in the United States, the photojournalism community globally isn't that big. So a lot of times people will know people. And most of us are happy to make recommendations if it's not something that works for us.
Awesome. And I'll grab that link to our spreadsheet and we can include it.
Yeah.
Bart says, great presentation. Michelle Canar, I think, was clarifying her earlier question. Let me find it. She said, visualization platforms. She was talking about data visualization.
I can't speak to that. It's not my area of expertise, but I think we've got a presentation coming up in a few months from one of my colleagues on data visualization. So that might be best reserved for that chat.
All right, great. And Elizabeth McNamara says, did you say Unsplash and Alamy are not good to use?
Alamy, I think, is fine. I think they're a legitimate organization. Unsplash, I have not looked into it for a long time. I think there's a lot of ethical questions around that organization with basically they just let people submit pictures at will, and then you can download them and use them at will. And the vetting process on the legal end used to not be very diligent. I don't know what it is now, but it used to be just a absolute Wild West. So that would cause concern for me, but they could have been changed, since I last looked at it a few years ago. But
all right, great.
Largely because they're free, which is always like a red flag for me. Like, I don't like the idea of free anyway, because you're undermining the market for photography to begin with when you start just, oh yeah, you can use these pictures for free. Nobody cares. You don't have to pay anything for it. Well, when someone's trying to make a living at it, that becomes a difficult thing to do to survive.
That makes sense. And then we have an anonymous post.
Yes.
Add the Diversify database.
So there are two fantastic, I wish I'd remembered this before, two fantastic databases one called Women Photograph and another one Diversify Photograph. And they are databases of, on the Women Photograph, women and non-binary photographers all over the world. And then Diversify is kind of the same thing, of photographers of diverse backgrounds. And they are organized by location. So state in the United States or countries more globally. And they are both fantastic databases.
Beautiful. That's great. Well, we got through all of our questions.
Oh, great.
Yeah, just a few minutes over. So again, thank you so much, Scott. This was great. We did have several people hang on. We still have 16 people here in the room.
Awesome.
So
thanks for
around. Thank you so much. We recorded this. It'll be available soon to anyone that registered and elsewhere as well. So thank you again. And we will be in touch.
Okay, great. Thanks for showing up. Bye.
Bye, everybody.